The foundations of slavery, 1600 to 1865. In the early days of America, as the land began to take shape, an abhorrent institution was quietly building its foundations. Slavery, woven into the very fabric of the economy, was more than just an economic necessity. It was a cruel system that brutally dehumanized millions of African people. Through the transatlantic slave trade, Africa's rich cultures were torn apart as men, women, and children were shackled, sold, and forced into backbreaking labor on plantations that powered the southern economy. Though the U.S. banned the importation of slaves in 1808, the horrific practice endured, fueling the growth of an economy based on violence and generational bondage. Slavery's death grip on the country only began to loosen after the Civil War, leaving scars that would last for generations. The Trail of Tears and Indian Removal, 1830 to 1850. In the early 1800s, the U.S. government began a relentless campaign of forced relocation, systematically uprooting tens of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 authorized the displacement of entire nations, and their journey westward became a tragic odyssey known as the Trail of Tears. Beneath a sky heavy with grief, thousands of Native Americans, women, children, elders, were marched relentlessly through the wilderness. With little to protect them, they suffered from starvation, disease, and exposure, and by the time they reached the barren lands of Oklahoma, nearly 4,000 souls had perished, their lives swallowed by the government's indifference. The Sand Creek Massacre, 1864. On the windswept plains of Colorado, a group of Cheyenne and Arapaho people sought refuge under the banner of peace. They waved the flag of surrender, hoping for safety, yet were met with the cruelest betrayal. Led by Colonel John Chivington, U.S. volunteer soldiers descended upon them with a savage fury, cutting down over 150 men, women, and children in cold blood. The massacre, which shocked even the perpetrators, left the ground stained with innocent lives, and though investigations followed, justice was a rare visitor in the face of such blatant cruelty. Jim Crow and legalized white supremacy, 1870s to 1965. In the aftermath of the Civil War, America faced the temptation to build a more just society. But instead, the legacy of slavery was perpetuated by a brutal system of racial segregation known as Jim Crow. Across the South, laws were passed to reassert white supremacy, enforcing a rigid divide between black and white Americans. Black people were stripped of voting rights, education, and even basic human dignity. Lynch mobs roamed freely, terrorizing black communities, while justice seemed to vanish into the shadows. From the 1870s to the 1960s, generations of black Americans lived in fear, subjected to violence and systematic disenfranchisement. The Wounded Knee Massacre, 1890. On a snowy December morning at Wounded Knee Creek, the U.S. Army encountered the Lakota Sioux, who were in the midst of performing the ghost dance, a spiritual ritual believed to bring peace. The atmosphere was tense, but still, the U.S. soldiers opened fire. What began as a brief, accidental shot erupted into a bloody massacre. Within minutes, over 250 Native American men, women, and children were dead, their bodies littering the snow. The massacre marked the brutal end of the Native resistance to U.S. expansion, a tragic reminder of the relentless and unforgiving march of American imperialism. The overthrow of Hawaii's monarchy, 1893 to 1898. In the lush islands of Hawaii, a rich cultural history thrived for centuries. But in 1893, American sugar barons, with the backing of U.S. Marines, orchestrated a coup that toppled Queen Liliuokalani's monarchy. The U.S. government moved swiftly, annexing the islands in 1898 without the consent of the Hawaiian people. The Moro Crater Massacre, 1906. On the island of Jolo, in the Philippines, the U.S. military launched an all-out assault on a group of Moro villagers. Trapped inside a volcanic crater, nearly 1,000 men, women, and children had nowhere to run. U.S. forces opened fire with artillery and machine guns, slaughtering the helpless villagers in what would be known as the Moro Crater Massacre. The Red Summer of Racial Terror, 1919. In the wake of World War I, racial tensions ignited in cities across the U.S., culminating in what became known as the Red Summer. White mobs rampaged through black neighborhoods in more than 24 cities from Chicago to Washington, D.C. to Elaine, Arkansas, killing hundreds and leaving thousands homeless. These violent attacks were often ignored or tacitly supported by local authorities. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study, 1932 to 1972. In the dark and quiet corners of Alabama, the U.S. Public Health Service conducted one of the most appalling betrayals of trust in American history. For decades, 600 black men with syphilis were allowed to suffer untreated so that researchers could observe the disease's progress. Even after penicillin was discovered as a cure in the 1940s, it was withheld from the men. Many died, and the suffering rippled out to their families. Japanese-American internment, 1942 to 1945, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, fear and prejudice overtook reason. The U.S. government forcibly relocated and imprisoned over 120,000 Japanese Americans, many of whom were citizens, simply because of their heritage. Stripped of their homes, businesses, and basic rights, they were detained in remote internment camps. Despite no evidence of disloyalty, entire families were held in isolation, their lives uprooted by wartime hysteria. Atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 1945. As World War II neared its end, two Japanese cities were forever altered by a weapon of unimaginable destruction. In August 1945, the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing over 100,000 civilians in an instant. The explosions turned the cities into smoldering ruins, and those who survived lived with the lasting scars of radiation. Backing mass murder in Indonesia, 1965 to 1966. In the mid-1960s, the U.S. backed a deadly purge in Indonesia, providing intelligence and diplomatic support to the military regime led by General Suharto. Tens of thousands of suspected communists and ethnic Chinese were massacred. As the blood flowed, the U.S. turned a blind eye, showing that, in the name of anti-communism, any cost to human life was deemed acceptable. The Mai Lai Massacre, 1968. In the jungles of Vietnam, American soldiers entered the village of Mai Lai and unleashed a brutal massacre. Over 500 civilians, mostly women, children, and the elderly, were murdered in cold blood. The attack, which lasted for hours, was initially covered up until whistleblowers revealed the truth. The Iraq War and false WMD claims, 2003. The U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 was based on the false premise that Saddam Hussein was stockpiling weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. Despite thorough inspections, no WMDs were ever found. The war led to widespread destruction, the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, and a prolonged insurgency. The chaos birthed ISIS and destabilized the entire Middle East, with consequences still being felt today. The Highway of Death, 1991. As Iraqi forces retreated from Kuwait, U.S. aircraft bombed convoys along Highway 80, destroying hundreds of vehicles and killing many soldiers and civilians. The scale and brutality of the attack drew criticism, even within the military, as it appeared to be a disproportionate use of force against fleeing troops. Abu Ghraib, prison torture, 2003 to 2004. When images surfaced of U.S. military personnel torturing detainees at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, the world was shocked by the brutal, systematic abuse. Prisoners were beaten, sexually abused, and subjected to psychological torment, all while the U.S. government turned a blind eye. The scandal revealed deep flaws in the chain of command and undermined America's credibility as a force for human rights. Supporting dirty wars in Latin America, 1960s to 1990s. Throughout the Cold War, the U.S. supported brutal military regimes in Latin America, providing them with training, resources, and political backing as they engaged in state-sponsored terror. From Chile's Pinochet regime to Argentina's dirty war, the U.S. looked the other way as these regimes executed, tortured, and disappeared thousands of their citizens in the name of anti-communism. Family separations at the border, 2017 to 2018. The Trump administration's zero-tolerance immigration policy caused the forced separation of thousands of migrant children from their parents at the U.S.-Mexico border. The policy was executed with little regard for the trauma it caused, leaving families permanently scarred. Many children were kept in cages and held in unsanitary conditions, with no clear path for reunification.